Welcome, everybody, to the Photovoice podcast, People, Power, and Photovoice. The title of this podcast today is called There Be Monsters, Balancing Power and Photovoice. We are really excited to have you here for the Journal of Health Promotion Practice special series of podcasts on people, power, and photovoice, and the little method that could change the world, as my co-editor Bob says. My name's Robin Evans Agnew. I'm a co-editor of this special issue, coming up totally focused on Photovoice in January 2022. For those of you new to Photovoice, it's a participatory visual method where participants take and discuss photos on health promotion issues relevant to their lives and then act to change them through raising awareness, mitigation of the problems, or transformation of the policies that oppress. In advance of publication, we wanted you to meet some of the folks behind the special issue with a brief opportunity to chat about their experiences with the method, the people they work with, their thoughts about the roots and the frontiers of application for this method in the world of health promotion. So now it's time for you to meet my amazing co-editor, the inimitable Bob Strack, who will be introducing our guests. And I think you've got a little line that you wanted to kind of read and intro people with as well, right, Bob?
I do. I mean, I'm like you. I'm excited. These discussions become so interesting because we have so many interesting people doing interesting work. And today we're joined by Jody Early, who's on faculty at the University of Washington, Bothell, and we're with Victoria Sanchez, who's at the University of New Mexico. I was going to introduce them separately, but their interests and overlaps are so similar that I can honestly just talk about both of them relative to their involvement with vulnerable populations, their engagement with free area. You're like us, you sort of come out of the free area in school, and your just belief that power is within the people that we work with. So looking at your record, your CBPR, your use of Photovoice is perfect for what we want to talk about today. So I'm real excited. And I know we've talked about some questions, but to get us kind of going, I wanted to revisit, because we're talking about power, right? And we're talking about how Photovoice resides within that. And, you know, when I think about power, I go back to Carolyn Wong and Marianne Burris's original piece where they talked about how it's useful to think about power to, power with, and power over as three different kinds of the processes. That each has its own distinct reality, but they're also distinct, right? They go on to talk about power to as an affirming power, or the ability to accomplish things. Power with is the ability to work other people towards a common purpose. And power over is the ability to influence or direct people or the physical and natural environment. You know, and that sort of framing that they gave to us from the original piece to today still is a part and parcel of the method. And so we just kind of want to get things going and kind of ask about why and what is important in terms of talking about power within Photovoice. What's your view? How have you come down on this? Go ahead, Jody.
Our guests are stunned. They don't know what to say. Jody, why don't you go first?
This is the power with, where we share the power with you.
You know, I've been thinking a lot about this. First, I was reading Foucault lately, and I think about what
always a bedtime story, right? With
right,
Foucault,
you know,
isn't it?
Yeah, a little bit,
exactly.
Light reading. Yeah. But about he talks about how it's a constant flux of negotiation. And so when we talk about often the phrase balancing power, I think it's more about shifting and that negotiation. And so part of what I think Victoria and I have talked about outside of this podcast is how does this happen all along the way? It's not just at one point, right? It happens all along the way. The other thing I've been thinking a lot about is this use of power, and especially the term empowerment, and how it comes up so much in our writings about Photovoice. But I think Wang and Burris talked about the fact that in order to be empowered, or when we talk about empowerment, people have to have access to knowledge, access to decision-making, access to resources, and access to networks. So I think that's also something that might frame this conversation today as we're talking about power to, right? Or power with, all of those, you know, how do those four things play into this methodology and our outcomes, our hopeful outcomes? Victoria, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, as I was thinking about this, and of course, we've been influenced by many people in the field, I came across a thing by Carolyn Wang that said, and I think this has to do with power. I mean, I think that this is about how we enter the process as learners, not as experts. We can be guiders. I think that in terms of power, it goes along each of the phases in a Photovoice project. I think power starts with who asks the questions, what communities we engage with. Bob, I was reading one of your pieces when you were working with youth, and I'm thinking, a youth community and working within that focus of power is very different than maybe working with other communities, just from who youth are in a social dimension and who they are in the social dimensions. I'm thinking about power as this idea of collective empowerment, which is much more, I think, consistent with the outcomes of Photovoice than maybe thinking just about individual empowerment. And so when we think about power, we're looking in Photovoice at power to achieve a social action or to achieve social change. And I think that goes back to resources and a lot of other things. I'm going to stop there.
You say social action. I love that idea, right? It's a social thing. Mm-hmm. It's like what Jody was talking about, sort of like in the constant flux of negotiation, right? So the social action, people talk about it, right? Back and forth. Through dialogue comes that sharing of power, or through dialogue comes that constant flux, right, of negotiating power over voice. That's kind of what you were talking about in terms of collective action. Yeah.
Yeah, I think Photovoice is always about any kind of participatory action research, and Photovoice, I think, falls into that. Really is about negotiating power from the outset. So it's negotiating with, how do we choose communities? How do we work with communities? Who gets to the table? There's also power within the communities that we're working with. Not everybody has an equal voice, and I think it would be naive for us to think that everybody at the table has an equal voice or equal power. And I've seen this play out in much of my research where there is not equity within even a group. And so I think Photovoice has the potential to really equalize that power, because when people are able to answer the questions in ways that are meaningful to them through the photographs they take, they are able then to think about and socially construct what this means individually and then as a collective. I think it actually does shift, and it has the potential to shift power imbalances within a partnership, or within a partnership between the community and an academic, or even within community members themselves. I've seen that happen not in very specific ways and more nuanced ways. But I do think that we think about often power between the researcher and the community, but I don't want to miss the power imbalances that exist within community. And then our role, perhaps as facilitators, to help bring that imbalance to a more balanced perspective through some of the Photovoice methodologies that we can use, and the critical consciousness questioning that we can bring to the communities. Does that make sense to you all?
Yeah, so it's sort of like an awareness when you go in, because I am thinking about the community organizations. I remember my first project was in the schools, in Seattle schools, and I was meeting with kids in a health office inside a health room in a high school. And I had a very grumpy nurse. And I'm a school nurse, so I like school nurses, but this one was a very grumpy nurse. And she was very upset that we were sort of going over time. There's just a lot of things that there were negotiations kind of going on about my right to be there with the youth that this nurse was, taking care of. And it was just it was very interesting in terms of, I ended up having to sort of protect the space, right, for the meeting, right? I had to sort of set some boundaries and navigate that. And that's sort of like, that's facilitating sort of beyond just the power that comes with the kids and the voices and the photos. It's this other sort of layer that comes in with working inside community organizations. How about you, Jody? How does it
I was thinking what you were talking about, Victoria, and just, I'd love to read more in the work that's published about Photovoice, about the reflexivity in the process. Like, how do people go about that process within them, like thinking within themselves as the researcher? And I think about this theory of intersectionality and how that impacts this whole collaboration together. There's that reflexivity with the researcher thinking about the positionality, or maybe it doesn't happen enough, but how we don't see that a lot in our journals, and how it would be nice to see more of that. But also in sort of priming or preparing to engage in this together collaboratively, a dialogue around what are we all bringing to this. And to what you were saying, Victoria, you know, in many of the projects that I've been involved with, having this spirit of, we may share, you know, a particular heritage, but, you know, I do not live my life as a undocumented individual. This was a recent project I was asked to be a part of, and understanding that, you know, I'm there to learn and I'm there to listen. But there are these tensions that happen even within the process itself. But I think the point I wanted to make is, you know, how much of that reflexivity are we having before we, you know, how much of that in our preparation do we do?
Are you talking about, I'm curious, are you talking about reflexivity on the part of the researcher, project leader, or on the part of the participants?
I'm actually talking about both. So, you know, going into this as the researcher, as a guide, doing that yourself, but then also, is there an opportunity to even talk about that within the group that you're working with? So Victoria, to your point, you know, there's all of these other, and I think it was Supla that talks about this, what's not being talked about in part of this process? Like, what are these other power struggles and dynamics that are happening within Photovoice that we're not talking about in the research itself?
I think that's exactly right. You know, I think, you know, Victoria, when you were talking, it struck me, when we think about power, we're always talking about it relative to authoritative power, right? And that's typically where people's brains go, like, who's got the authority to make a decision? Who's got the resources to dole out money? But if you look at French and Raven, and you mentioned Foucault, you look at French and Raven, and they have informational power and reverent power. Those have nothing to do with, you know, purse strings. It has everything to do with knowledge. And you think about, I don't know if you've had this experience doing Photovoice projects, but often, you know, you go before an IRB and you kind of say, this is what we're working on. And they're saying, well, what topic are you working on? And what's your solution? I said, and I always say, I don't know. It's up to my participants. It's up to my collaborators. It's up to my research partners, who are my photographers, who are going to determine what the issue is. And so I don't claim that power out of the gate, right? And so in that case, there's a deference to that informational power, that genuine experience that you're inviting and asking people to be co-researchers with you. And it's often, I don't know, do you have the experience where you have to kind of explain that to your colleague researchers who don't do this kind of participatory work?
Yeah, of course. But yeah, I think this is also an opportunity for us to work with our colleagues to really guide them and inform them about new ways of knowing. I think that the value in Photovoice, that it really is knowledge production it can be in the best sense of the word, and democracy of knowledge. And I think if we think about, you know, what research is, it's unveiling and uncovering new ways of knowing and new knowledge. So I think that we could actually use Photovoice and other participatory approaches with our IRBs to try to get them to expand and to think outside the box. I think a number of people are doing this in the country, getting community IRBs going, who really listen to what's happening in community. But to somebody else's point, I think for me, the whole, much of the Photovoice process boils down to that idea of, whether you're a researcher or community, or whether you're facilitating, that is kind of that, you know, that Freudian triad of listening, dialogue, and action, you know, and then that iteration that comes from each of those stages. And I think that happens at every stage of the research, from the inception through even changing. Participants may not stay, participants may come and go. So I think there's just this beautiful iterative process that happens in Photovoice, where we can see power changing and shifting, and we can actually facilitate that both with our colleagues and within the communities that we work. I got a little off topic there.
Okay, yeah, but I want to follow up on that, because you've been really engaged, Victoria, a long time on sort of CBPR designs and thinking around how CBPR acts and works in communities. So Photovoice has been plunking along, you know, gathering interested people for here and there, and then now we're doing a special issue. But what learnings from CBPR could be really imputed or introduced inside the way Photovoice is currently sort of conceived or enacted, right? I'm thinking about Jody's point about Could the participant reflexivity be a more important part? Is that something that CBPR designs are trying to advance and have people in groups encounter the power dynamics that are working within them in different ways? What sort of things could CBPR teach Photovoice right now at this juncture?
That's the $60,000 question. Jody, let me think about it for a minute. Go ahead.
Jody's got one.
So as Victoria and I have been talking about this, I wrote down a list of questions that I think would be great to infuse into planning in this type of way. But I think the big soundbite is, I'm always thinking about, are we just replicating existing systems? Like, is this colonizing methodology saying that it's not, but is it? And it happens from everything to like, what's the reciprocity? What's the, and it goes back to what Victoria was saying, like, what are we really trying to achieve, and who's the impetus, and who's bringing this question, and what are the ultimate goals? Who's at the table? If we think about, again, going back to power, who needs to be at the table, right? So in terms of networks and really creating that policy change, that is the triad, right? That piece, the policy change and action, who do we need to also be connected with? Photovoice could be at times, it could be, handing people cameras or their phones, using their phones and showing what they perceive to be lived realities. But the ultimate is, how are we really creating that social change? And thinking about so whose voices are being heard, whose are not? Do images that are chosen, like who's choosing those? Are they reinforcing, stereotypes? What's the unintended consequences? What are potential unintended consequences? And what's meaningful dissemination? That there, in terms of CBPR, I think we talk a lot about that. So what is that meaningful dissemination with Photovoice? It may not be. I was in a project where exhibit was not an option, with working with undocumented students, not in the way that you would typically see this written about. They did not want to be physically there at an exhibit. They wanted to record narratives to go along with this. So, that again goes back to that negotiation of power and
having that kind of top level sort of understanding of whether we're recreating institutions of oppression in our work, right? Fascinating stuff.
Also, yeah, you raise a point, Jody, and Robin asked about CBPR. We're talking about power within that framework, right? And so the thing that strikes me is our definition of community. It's sort of that prickly topic that always comes up about where do you define the boundaries of community? So, in Baltimore, we did projects with, you were mentioning the article earlier, Victoria, with young people, right? Was our community just Highlandtown, Canton? Or was the community inclusive of the researchers and the civic leaders that we were pulling in? And where you draw those boundaries creates an opportunity to examine where the power needs to come into play. It's unrealistic to have a young person be connected to the mayor, but it might not be unrealistic for the researcher to have a connection where you can be a linker, a connector between those two voices in the community. And so how we use CBPR to define the boundaries of community and people's ethical roles to use their power within that framework, I think is kind of what Robin was getting at. And I think it's exciting to see the work that you guys are doing to kind of ask those questions.
When you were talking about that, I was thinking about one of the core principles of Barbara Israel's CBPR and other folks. And, it comes from Guy Stewart, communities of identity, communities of practice, and communities of solution. And I think that in terms of Photovoice, I think it kind of was, when you were talking about that experience, Bob, I think it really refers back to that. It's who's at the table, and who's identifying with this topic. But then the communities of solution may have to be other stakeholders and people that have different kinds of power, the policymakers. Wang would argue that you need policymakers there from the beginning. I actually don't know if I totally agree with that because of the power differentials if you're working with students and policymakers. But I think of communities of identity, practice, and solution as one way to think about how to organize and frame who's at the table at what junctures and in what phases of a Photovoice project.
Lots to talk about, isn't it?
That is lovely. Oh my gosh. Fantastic. Bob, you're right. we're probably out of time. But guys, check these podcasts back. We got a surprise podcast coming up in this. Victoria's hooked us up with someone amazing. You're going to want to hear this as well. So this wraps up our short segment. Well done, everybody. I'm so super enthused about this idea of connecting more deeply to the CBPR roots of Photovoice in engaging with and learning about how to manage power and negotiate the flux. Thanks so much, Jody, and thanks so much, Victoria, for being here. Who were you talking about, Victoria?
Guy Stewart. He
Guy
was
Stewart,
a special epidemiologist who worked in South Africa and came to UNC, and just Jeannie Eng and Barbara Israel were his proteges. And then Jeannie was the chair of my committee. So by extension,
right.
I stewarded.
I've been wanting to ask, because I was just looking at the Flint Photovoice thing that Caroline Wang did, and she did include a council member on the writing team for that. And, you know, you can't read between the lines. You just don't know quite the level of involvement or what was happening with that. But if we get a chance to talk to Caroline Wang, that would be something I'd really like to ask her, is how did it work really to have a policymaker right there at the beginning? Because you've got Barbara Israel's book that, you know, had the North Carolina study, and they were like, yes, it's, you know, Lopez, I think it was. And she was like, yeah, you've got to have policymakers. But I've tried, and it's really difficult. They're really busy. They don't have the time to sit around with this long CBPR activity, right?
That was Alan Lopez.
Yeah.
Alan Smoker Lopez. She was one of my good friends at UNC. Yeah.
Right. It was a very influential article, but at the same time, it's really, really difficult to do. I don't know whether you've had any experience with that, Bob, in terms of how do you navigate the power with these stakeholders or these policymakers inside that?
Well, you know, we were talking earlier with Michelle, Teddy, and Jody, you're talking about the displays and the dissemination. And I was commenting to Michelle that I always love it when you have a public exhibit and you get the mayor there, you get the comptroller. I mean, in Baltimore, we got the state comptroller to come see the exhibit, right? And I think I wrote about it in the article, but this one boy's photo he didn't want to put in because he didn't want people to know he went to a bad school. He said a crappy school. But then when he had a chance to talk with this state controller who controlled the money of the state, the young boy didn't know who it was. But once he realized what he was doing, and he realized that his observation about his school was moving this, 58, 60-year-old man, he realized that he had something of importance that this person wanted to know. And just to see the swelling of pride in the young boy and to see the shift in the old man was one of those dynamics. And so how do you do it? You create the space for that sharing of informational power, experience power, to rub elbows with authoritative power and regulatory power. That's how you do it. But you got to create the space. And I think it's ethical of facilitators and researchers to make sure they use their power to make those connections happen,
Yeah. Go ahead, Jody, because I have a cool example of that.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I remember a project where it was a huge community, multiple organization project to look at what does health and well-being look like in Snohomish County. And the idea was to have communities within communities talking about, ways in which the things that they wanted to measure. So it was really a decolonizing methodology that was led by this Providence Institute for a Healthier Community. And I remember one particular group I was working with, they were using Photovoice, and I was thinking, oh, well, there's this county summit coming up. There's this county-wide conference. I can wonder if they'd be interested in sharing this exhibit there. And they did. And then it ended up being on their website and, all these different, it took a while to get there. But the point was, Bob, to your point, so the power that we bring, the resources we bring, the networks we bring, that's really helping to, I think, amplify the work further. So helping people understand that as part of this process, or who could potentially be reached if we're really trying to create that social change, is probably something we need to spend a little bit more time talking about.
That's the struggle, right? Because it's such a broad method. And then you start asking yourself, what are we measuring? What are we evaluating? is the extension of a network that a community has. Is that an increasing of power? Absolutely. So just measuring whether or not they're connected with agencies that they weren't prior to the method, that's an outcome.
Mhm.
That's a systemic change that's occurred. You might not have changed the
Social
law.
capital.
Social capital, right? Just and so all those pieces and parts are part of the method that needs to be kind of nudged, examined, pushed, grown, made people aware of.
One of the ways that we engage in a Photovoice project in a rural setting in New Mexico was we did this big Photovoice project, but then we had the students actually take their enlarged photos with their shared captions to their school board. And we took the exhibit to the school board, and then we actually had a little public display. But yeah, and the board loved it. All I had to do was sit there as as the university person, but the students presented and the board loved it, and they decided to do a couple of smaller policy things. But what I wanted to say that I think is even more important as I think about Photovoice is oftentimes I think of it as an embedded methodology within a larger, longer term systemic change initiative, so that it's not a standalone one-shot deal. I don't think it's that effective if it is. But in the work that I've done, it becomes part of a larger action planning process. And it's just one methodology to bring a particular group of people into a place where they may not have voice or power, especially if you're working in a larger community setting. And so I think the value of Photovoice is really working in conjunction with a larger effort to create change and not as a standalone method, because I think, as we know, change takes a long time. Policy change takes time.
I agree.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
anyway.
It's an incredible commitment. I have an example of that in my own work and I want to get back to, this is on the little topic of that word, that special word we have called empowerment, which is flung around and abused. And Victoria, you've given me hope for the word empowerment by suggesting that we add collective empowerment, and that gives us a better way of sort of tackling some of the colonialist assumptions around empowerment. Yeah, it's nice. But, so working with these Latina mums, they took photos of indoor environments and stuff like that. And as the project went on, this is a larger CBPR project, they began to use the photos in different ways, right? They began to carry the photos with them to presentations. And if they were just going to sit there and talk in front of a group, they wanted to have the photographs there to show. This is their evidence, but this was also the prompt for talking, the script for talking. To me, that was a sort of the way the photograph acts as an empowerment mechanism, just as a tool for those kids sitting in front of the school board to have this photo that they're holding, something physical. It's not like a movie or something. It's just something physical that they're holding that then they're allowed to talk about and maybe reinterpret as well. I just think that that's part of that edge that Photovoice has inside some part of the development of empowerment within collective action. Perhaps.
Nice.
Fascinating.
Nice.
Fascinating. So what happened with the county project that you were working on, Jody? What changes were made up there for?
Oh, it's a long story, but it was really interesting. And so as Victoria said, this was, I think, if you could think about it as one embedded strategy. So there was a lot that went into this. I was on advising for some of these participatory methods, but interviews, tribal communities, Latina mothers, community health workers, all of these conversations looking at themes that emerged from the Photovoice presentation about what is it the county wants to measure. And they ended up coming up with 24 different indicators. And then from there, they developed what they call the health and well-being survey. So they're using that now in the county to complement the county health department data, but these different organizations, there's like 69 different organizations working with the Institute, have also started to use this. So in other ways, it's like this, everybody is sort of, they came together around, these are things that we want to see and measure, and then they will be using it in ways that are useful for them, even within their organization. So, that was one way. I'm thinking about another example too of just like, I've been working with farm workers in Eastern Washington for about 6 years, and we've been working on right now there's no policy in the state of Washington. There's no law that requires ag to require sexual harassment training. Even though it's a federal level, that ag is exempt from that. So states like California have this, but we don't have that here in Washington. And we know that sexual violence is really rampant within agriculture. And so farm workers had come to a colleague of mine who's a community engagement specialist with Pacific Northwest Agricultural Safety and Health Center and said, your center provides all of this training for pesticide prevention, heat, but we can't think about those things because when we go to work, we're constantly being, trying to be coerced, harassed, so we need training. We need to create something that will be a training so that we can, bring light. So that was the beginning of this really learning about this, but this group of farm worker women have led to writing a script that was developed into a video that has created a training that is now, we have the Washington Growers Association, Farm Bureau, all of these things came together. You can thank Bob Ferguson for some of his work in prosecuting some of the biggest cases.
That's our great state attorney in the great state of Washington right now.
But we're working in partnership with a coalition that actually wants to make a change policy-wise. And the farm worker women that have been involved with this project are now attending, a part of these coalition meetings. And so they've testified before the state. So it's really, I think, Victoria, what you said is so key, that it's an embedded strategy and that if you can connect to this work related to policy change, that's where it's.
You know what all three of you have brought up in turn? Each one of you were talking about the issue, but in the process, you told a story. You went back and you told a story about how the method, Photovoice, created space to tell a story. And we've been talking about power relative to people. We haven't yet talked about power of persuasion and the message. And so do you persuade people with data, with statistics, or do you persuade people with a personal, story, a connection of humanity? And each one of you went to a story. And so that's a whole additional aspect of power that we haven't even peeled back the covers on. And if you look at corporate America, over the course of the last 8 years, they've identified story as an important element of persuasion, and public health is, jumping on that bandwagon. You look at the disinformation going on in America, you look at the infodemic that's occurring. It's really an invitation for us to really do a better job of storytelling. And I mean, each one of you used stories as a marker of persuasion, as a marker of a new way to provide power to a message. It's interesting.
Yeah, and there's
it reminds me of that word co-optation. Their corporate America is co-opting some of our methodology and strategy, and they have the money.
Yeah, but this is the little method that could change the world, right? And we debate amongst ourselves in terms of the power to speak inside a Photovoice image, right? Is that a group? Is it a group text? Is it a group created text? It's a co-created text, right? Usually, sometimes not. But the text and the photo kind of go together. In my experience, the photo, the women had the text on the back of the photograph, right? That they had written like 6 months earlier, and they're holding it up for their presentation, but they're winging it. They're bringing in new stuff. I'm like scribbling furiously because this is new text. What do I do? Which text is appropriate with the photograph that they took? Which one now has meaning? It's co-created, right? It's changing its meaning. And so we worry sometimes like the photo might be misinterpreted. Like I can still remember the photos inside articles better than I can remember what people said in the articles, right? The photos inside Photovoice articles tell that story. So I agree with Bob. I think that carries us along a longer way, I think, in terms of creating those stories for change. Wow.
Gosh, I just had this wonderful thought and it just went out, but it might come back. I don't know. Who knows?
Oh my God, we lost the Victoria Sanchez thought.
Oh no,
there.
You can. Victoria Sanchez so very, very frequently. This is my last week before I retire, so I am like just winding down. This is my last full week of being a faculty member here.
Well, so if you were to
Berg,
teach,
you can have a second chapter on your second retirement, a third chapter on your fourth
Right?
you're right next to Roy Schaefer
Jr.
Well, if it does come to you, Victoria, let us know, because I think what your extent of your experience with this deep method, CBPR, has really sort of helped inform that. And like that article from North Carolina, the what I call the Lopez article in my head, it Photovoice has been part of the story for CBPR, right? Over time. Caroline Wang wasn't necessarily doing CBPR when she was, bringing it up in Yunnan, China, but she was doing a lot of those negotiations. I spent some time this morning writing down all of the different organizations that she was partnering with. I'm prepping for a Caroline Wang interview that might happen. I don't know. Stay tuned. But that negotiation with all of those different organizations in China, with the Ford Foundation being one of the sort of like American institutions, that's a navigation of different power structures as well. Having to do all of those different sorts of negotiations over time, Victoria. What would be your central way to kind of, how do you keep a sense of yourself and a sense of your identity within the work?
Oh, that's the easy question, which I'll answer with a different answer.
Okay.
So when you were talking about photo, and I was thinking, and this might be a way to frame my answer, is that one of the struggles that I've seen is that when people take photos and then they share them, other people want to interpret their photos for them. They're saying, oh, I think you really mean this, or I see this differently. And then it's an opportunity for us to engage in that really reflective process of going into and using a collective showed methodology, or using something to continue to ground and to listen to both perspectives, but to try to really honor the person who took the photo and their interpretation and their meaning and their way of speaking to
their knowledge, right?
The power that this photo has for them. And at the same time, honoring the person who's arguing with the person who took the photo, or not arguing, but having a different perspective. And then maybe steering them into their own photo or something like that. But I do think that for me, it goes back to just staying present and listening and reflecting with the participants, and then figuring out what the next step is. I mean, for me, it's never a simple process of listening and dialoguing and action, but it follows that process for me almost all of the time in different iterations. Whether you're doing assessment or planning or evaluation, it's still that process of being present and going through that dialogical method. I don't know if that answered your question.
No, I'm really interested in that idea of listening, because when we teach qualitative methods to students, how many actual like long classes have we done? Have I done a 90-minute class on listening? But it's really, listening is super difficult to do. You've got your own identity, your own thoughts, your own lack of focus. Look at me. And then so having that sort of mindfulness, right, in terms of your own practice, being aware, noticing your own self, your own reactions to things, your own reactions to the photographs or other things like that, and then also noticing your interactions with others, and then noticing the larger thing, like the space you're in, the organization that you're working for, the grant that you've still got to write when you go back home, or the larger vision of how this is actually going to move this project along, right? So there's a lot of different ways that we have of listening, but we don't necessarily write that much. I haven't written that much. I haven't read that much about this act of listening. So thank you for that.
Well, I think Jody talked about it. I think part of it is that self-reflexivity.
Yeah.
And that
Yes.
capacity and willingness to just sit with what's there. And it's very difficult sometimes.
Robin, you and I have been talking with a lot of folks on this, and it seems to me that the people doing this work have a curiosity to hear, which I think is a fundamental element of listening. I mean, you both have expressed in your stories this curiosity about humans, this curiosity about what you don't know, what others do know. And I've kind of noticed, not to take away from your point, but to amplify your point, Robin, this concept of shared power has a lot to do with that curiosity that we have for each other as human beings, occupying a similar community that we might not even understand each other. So, I mean, I think it's a listening and hearing, that's all part of power. And I love the fact that you kind of talked about how do we train ourselves to be better listeners?
Yes.
That's beautiful.
Practice, practice, practice. Presence, presence, presence. I don't know. It's not easy. And sometimes, I mean, Jody and I were talking when we were thinking about this little maybe piece that we want to write. And, I go back to Mary Meekler's adage of, honor thy community, but don't make it holy. So what happens when you're working with a community where there's a lot of contention, when there's dissension, when there are interpretations of a photo that are actually could disrupt a process, not promote a positive change process? What's our role as researchers? What's our role as ethical people? And how do we do that? I mean, to me, that is a question that I don't know how to do well. I don't know. Maybe I would love to hear how you guys have handled.
No, I'm waiting we're both waiting to read your article on it so you can tell us.
No, I'm stuck because I have been involved in places where, the action or whatever the interpretation is not what I would consider a healthy or a positive or a proactive or a collective way of thinking about an issue. It doesn't happen often, but
I know what you're saying. And I actually was thinking about this today, how Photovoice is a method that, when people say they master or they are experts at particular methodologies, this is one that I think is different every time, right? And there's always these new questions or it's very obviously qualitative in that way, but it's very iterative. And I'm constantly, it's one of those things where I always think I have so much to learn. There's points where you're like, I've seen this before. I think I could, I know what I can help with. But at the same time, it's always like, wow, I didn't expect this. So I wish we had more of those opportunities to come together and really talk about the unplugged versions of our research and have those conversations like, wow, what didn't really work? Or, if we go back and we look at some of the work that's been published about Photovoice, okay, 5 years later, where's that organization? Where's that group? What's been changed? Like to your question, Robin, what happened? What happened after that with the county? So I think that would be an interesting thing to maybe as a follow-up to all of this, to maybe
even these conversations help us get to places where we're all have experiences, but also questions. I know Robin likes to give people a chance to kind of think about their work relative to their own personal future or the method. Robin, you want to kind of lay it out there?
What? What you want me to do?
Well, in some of the prior podcasts, we've had people tell a joke. So if you have a joke.
Okay. Yeah.
Formal and informal part of this. Where do you see yourself going in the future with this work? I mean, what's the next steps for you relative to not just power, but Photovoice also?
I'm interested in learning. I mean, I've always been drawn to community-based participatory research, really in my doctoral program, because my master's and undergraduate was very post-positive, very male. It wasn't until my PhD program, Committee of All Women and Feminist Theorists, where I introduced to bell hooks, to Paulo Freire, to this, and it just rocked my world. And I'm like, wow, I can, my background as an educator and my belief in access, my own, again, we go back to intersectionality and our own identities, right? My own experience as someone who, comes from a mixed family, someone who's first gen, who grew up in poverty, who never imagined that I would be, ever call myself a professor. And my personal beliefs about human rights and power, I think, drive. And I often talk about the fact that if I wasn't involved with more of the participatory and community engaged methodologies and got to connect communities with the work that I do and the teaching that I do, I wouldn't want to stay where I'm at. So I want to learn and explore more of these decolonizing methodologies and also work with the next generation of public health and health professionals, and really try to use this to dismantle those power structures that are in place. So constant learning, basically.
Simple job. You'll be done with that in about 5 years and come back and we'll do another podcast and look back.
We have so much to do.
Now you're launching, Victoria, in a new chapter. What's your direction next? What you going to do?
I'm retiring, so that's my new chapter. Yet, one of my colleagues and I did a wonderful, I was part of the interprofessional education team here on the Health Sciences Center at UNM. And we engaged in a Photovoice project last year with students from interdisciplines. And we actually trained both faculty separately and then students separately. And so if I have some energy, and I probably will, because I like working with this colleague, I think we're going to continue working with faculty development, because I think that faculty who want to go and do research with communities and sometimes in communities could benefit from a Photovoice or more of a CBPR approach. And they were really excited about doing it. But when we first introduced it, they just thought, oh, take a photo. It's more like photo elicitation. It's not the full enchilada, as I would say.
Right.
So I would like to maybe work with the next generation of researchers, because I think there aren't enough of us working out with communities. And I think that if we can work with the next generation of researchers who want to work within different community settings, it's a way of amplifying and really leveraging our resources in ways that might have a larger impact than individual researchers just working with individual communities over much time. I don't know. That's
a lot like the power of practice that you were talking about, that Guy Stewart was talking about, right? You, through practice with new colleagues or new faculty, if they're practicing a little bit of Photovoice, a big bit of CBPR, you get a full dose of co-creation of knowledge through that, don't you? Right? You cannot sit there and go, there is one fact and that is it, right? At some point in time, you have to be like Jody, going, oh my God, there are a ton more methodologies than what I was taught in my undergrad, right? I've been sort of colonized by post-positive, ideas of a fixed world, right? And that's exciting, I think, for people, but to kind of have Photovoice perhaps as a bridge to that practice. I'm putting words in your mouth, but I think that's somewhat what would be exciting for me to do that if I was to copy you and try and do that with my faculty.
It's accessible, and I would invite, I co-taught the CBPR seminar, or I don't know what it was called, whatever it's called. I've been so far distant from it for many years with Nina. And so each summer it's an institute, and it's a week-long institute. And Jody, you should come and join.
I would love that. New Mexico.
It's on, critical methodologies and indigenous ways of knowing.
Oh, I love that.
Yeah, I stopped teaching it because I got tired. But it's really amazing. We've had over 500 students come to our summer institute over 13 years. So I think it's a way for us to leverage and also expand the number of people who are using CBPR approaches, including, and I would include Photovoice in that.
Well, there you go. I think that's a perfectly beautiful plug. Either if you choose to go to UNC Greensboro, UNC Tacoma, or UNC Bothell, but the heart of Photovoice country really, and CBPR country, is in New Mexico. And I'm so glad, Victoria, you were able to join us and be on our special editorial board as well. It's just a complete treat for me, because I've read people, but I've never met people before. So this has been totally fun. And I've worked with Jody, but I never met her before. So now I know. Now we know each other. And Bob, obviously, total fan. And Arden, thanks again for coordinating and being our just most wonderful engineer and staying here and listening. And if you guys haven't listened to Arden's interviews, they are crackerjack with people. So thanks so much, Arden. Thank you, everybody.